At dawn on August 30th, 1776, British soldiers crept toward the American trenches on Brooklyn Heights. For 2 days, they had dug siege lines toward an army of 9,000 trapped men. The order to probe the defenses came just after first light. The redcoats climbed the earthworks with bayonets fixed and found campfires still smoldering. The trenches were empty. Every American soldier was gone. An army of 9,000 men had vanished overnight across a river nearly a mile wide. They took their horses, their cannon, and their ammunition with them. The Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet on Earth, sat anchored within sight and heard nothing. The escape saved George Washington's army and the American Revolution itself. How did an entire army disappear in a single night? The answer begins with a fisherman. 7 weeks earlier, in July of 1776, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled sailed into New York Harbor. More than 400 ships carried some 32,000 professional soldiers, including 8,000 hired Hessian troops from Germany. One observer wrote that the masts looked like a forest of trimmed pine trees. Against this force, Washington commanded roughly 19,000 men, most of whom had never fought a battle. New York was a trap disguised as a city. Manhattan and Long Island were islands, surrounded by deep rivers that British warships could sail at will. Washington's own generals warned him the position could not be held. Congress ordered him to hold it anyway.
If his army was captured there, the revolution would not survive the year. There was no second army coming. One regiment in Washington's army did not march like the others. The 14th Continental Regiment came from Marblehead, Massachusetts, a fishing town of steep streets and salt air.
Its colonel was John Glover, a 43-year-old fisherman and merchant who stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall. His men wore short blue seamen's jackets and white caps. Other soldiers mocked them as web-footed. Washington would soon need every one of them. Marblehead men had spent their lives hauling cod from the North Atlantic in open boats, in fog, in darkness, in winter gales. They could read wind and current the way other soldiers read a road. The regiment was also one of the most integrated units in the Army, with Black and Native American sailors serving in its ranks. They were about to become the most valuable men Washington had. On August 22, 1776, British flatboats began ferrying troops across the Narrows to Long Island. By nightfall, 15,000 soldiers stood on the beaches of Gravesend Bay, unopposed. 3 days later, another 5,000 Hessians joined them. Washington, unsure whether the landing was a feint, kept nearly half his army on Manhattan. The Americans defending Brooklyn numbered fewer than 10,000. The trap was being set. The American line ran along a ridge of wooded hills called the Heights of Guan. 4 passes cut through those hills. The Americans guarded 3 of them. The 4th, Jamaica Pass, on the far left, was watched by just 5 mounted militia officers. On the night of August 26th, General William Howe marched 10,000 men toward it in total silence. The 5 officers were captured without a shot. At 9 the next morning, August 27th, 2 signal cannons fired. Howe's column appeared behind the American line, and the front collapsed. Hessian bayonets drove the defenders through the woods into the guns waiting at their backs. Around 300 Americans were killed, and more than 1,000 captured within hours. The survivors fled into the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights, with their backs against the East River. One unit bought the fleeing army its escape. Around 260 soldiers of the 1st Maryland Regiment charged a British position at a stone farmhouse 6 times to hold the road open. Fewer than a dozen made it back to American lines. Watching from a hilltop, Washington reportedly cried out, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose."
The trade bought hours. Hours would matter.
By early afternoon, the British stood within 600 yards of the American earthworks. His officers begged General Howe to storm them and end the rebellion before dark. Howe refused. He had watched 1,000 of his men fall taking a single hill at Bunker Hill the year before. He ordered his army to dig siege trenches instead. The Americans, he reasoned, had nowhere to go. The numbers were simple. Just over 9,000 exhausted Americans held a line 1.5 miles long. In front of them, 20,000 British and Hessian troops dug closer by the hour. Behind them ran the East River, nearly a mile of tidal water patrolled by the largest fleet in the world. One British warship in that river would seal the trap forever. Washington had perhaps 2 days. On August 28th, a cold northeast storm broke over Brooklyn. Rain filled the American trenches until men stood waist-deep in water, their gunpowder soaked and useless. The same wind pinned the Royal Navy at anchor, unable to beat up the East River. Washington saw what the storm was offering him. It was not a defense. It was a door, and it would not stay open long. That same night, Washington did something that looked like madness. He sent boats to Manhattan and brought over more troops, feeding fresh regiments into the trap. Among them marched Glover's Marbleheaders. Every soldier watching drew the obvious conclusion. The general was reinforcing Brooklyn for a final stand. Even his own officers believed it. Only Washington knew the reinforcement was a disguise. He was assembling his oarsmen. Consider what Washington was actually proposing. A night evacuation across open water is one of the hardest maneuvers in warfare. An army retreating in darkness cannot see, cannot signal, and cannot fight. If the British attacked while half the army stood on the shore, the half in the trenches would be too thin to hold. Everyone still on the Brooklyn side would be killed or captured. And there was a deeper problem. 9,000 men cannot keep a secret. If the troops learned they were retreating, discipline could dissolve into a panicked rush for the boats. If a single deserter or local loyalist carried word to the British lines, Howe's army would storm the empty trenches at midnight. So Washington decided that his own army would not be told the plan. On the morning of August 29th, Washington's orders went out wrapped in a lie. Every boat that could be found on either river was to be collected by dark, officially to ferry over fresh militia from New Jersey. Regiments were told to be ready to move at night for an attack on the enemy. Soldiers sharpened bayonets for an assault. They were actually preparing to run. The boats came from everywhere. Sloops, whaleboats, flat-bottomed scows, pleasure craft, anything with a hull. By nightfall, a strange fleet crowded the Brooklyn ferry landing. The men chosen to row it were Glover's Marblehead Regiment, joined by another Massachusetts regiment of sailors from Salem. Perhaps a few hundred fishermen were now responsible for moving 9,000 soldiers, plus horses and cannon, before the sun rose. Run the arithmetic those fishermen faced. The East River crossing to Manhattan was roughly a mile each way. Every round trip, loading and unloading in darkness, could take an hour. 9,000 men in boats carrying perhaps 50 at a time meant close to 200 crossings. They had about 9 hours of darkness. The math did not work. They would do it anyway.
At 8 in the evening, the first regiments were pulled from the trenches. Officers whispered orders. No talking, no lights. Muskets carried loose so metal would not clank against metal. Wagon wheels were wrapped in rags. The sick and wounded went first, then the militia. As each unit slipped away, the men remaining in the line quietly spread sideways to fill the gaps they left behind. Then the water itself turned against them. The ebb tide ran fast, and the northeast wind whipped the river into whitecaps. The sailboats, which carried the heaviest loads, could not sail into that wind. For a while, only rowboats could cross, oars straining against wind and current at once. Some officers concluded the evacuation had already failed and sent word to Washington that it should be called off.
Around 11 o'clock, the wind died. Then it shifted to the southwest, the one direction that favored the crossing. The river flattened. The sailboats filled their canvas and joined the shuttle. No one on that shore could explain the timing, and many never tried. Washington's men simply loaded faster. From that hour on, the the strange fleet ran the mile of black water like clockwork. The Marbleheaders rowed with muffled oars, navigating by feel across a dark, moving river. They made the crossing again and again, hour after hour, loading boats so deep that water lapped within inches of the gunwales. One passenger recalled that the sailors handled the overloaded craft as calmly as if they were hauling nets at home. Horses, ammunition wagons, and all but the heaviest cannon went with them. On the Brooklyn shore, discipline held by a thread. Near the ferry landing, one waiting regiment began crowding toward the boats out of turn. Washington, who spent the night at the embarkation point, rode into the crush. By one account, he lifted a stone and threatened to sink the overloaded boat unless the men got out. They obeyed. The line reformed. The shuttle continued. 600 yards away, 20,000 British and Hessian soldiers slept within earshot of a fleeing army. Sentries stared into the rainy dark and saw nothing. But the men in the American trenches knew something the British did not. The timetable was already broken. Half the army was still on the wrong side of the river, and the darkness they needed was about to run out. Then the plan nearly killed itself. Around 2 a.m, a staff officer delivered a garbled order to the covering force still holding the trenches. The men meant to leave last. They understood it as their signal to withdraw. Entire regiments abandoned the line and marched for the ferry. For the better part of an hour, the earthworks facing Howe's army stood essentially empty. At the landing, the mistake collided with the general himself. Washington confronted the covering force's commander, who insisted he had been ordered out. The order was wrong. The men turned around. In the dark, in the rain, soldiers who believed they had just escaped marched back into the empty trenches and took up their muskets again. The British siege lines, yards away, had noticed nothing. Why hadn't they? Part of the answer was the storm drumming on tents and drowning the sounds of an army in motion. Part was Howe's certainty. His engineers measured progress in yards per day. The trap was closed. The rebels pinned. British doctrine said no army escaped across water without a navy. The British could not see the escape because they could not imagine it. There was one man who might have broken the secret. That night, a local woman sympathetic to the crown reportedly sent her servant to warn the British that the rebels were leaving. The servant was stopped by Hessian sentries who spoke no English and understood nothing he said. He was held until morning. The one warning that reached British lines died in translation. Toward 4 a.m, the sky in the east began to gray, and thousands of Americans still waited on the Brooklyn shore. Every calculation now pointed to catastrophe. Daylight would reveal the crowded ferry landing to British telescopes, and the Royal Navy needed only slack water to push a warship into the river. The evacuation had run out of night. Then, the fog came. It rose off the water thick enough, one soldier wrote, that you could scarcely see a man 6 yards away. It smothered the ferry landing, the river, and the American works, while the British side of the lines reportedly stayed clear. Under that gray blanket, the boats kept running long past sunrise. Men who lived through the night wrote for decades afterward about that fog, calling it providential. The covering force came out last, walking backward out of the trenches in squads, leaving campfires burning and a few spiked cannon too heavy for the mud. Among the final men at the landing stood Washington, who by most accounts refused to board until the rear guard was away. One of the last boats pushed off, carrying the general who could not be allowed to exist captured. As the fog began to thin, British patrols crept forward and reached the empty works. Alarm guns fired. Redcoats sprinted to the ferry landing and saw the last American boats pulling out of musket range across the river. 9,000 men gone. But Washington's army had escaped to Manhattan, which was also an island. The trap had not been broken. It had only moved. In London and New York, the British called it what it looked like, a rout. Howe had taken Long Island, inflicted perhaps 3,000 casualties in killed, wounded, and captured, and lost a few hundred of his own. By every rule of 18th century warfare, he had won. But the object of the campaign was Washington's army, and Washington's army was still stubbornly alive. The escape saved the army's body. It could not save its spirit. On Manhattan, militiamen deserted by the hundreds, some walking home carrying their muskets. Washington wrote to Congress that if he were called on to declare on oath whether the militia had been most useful or hurtful, he would subscribe to the latter. He had 9,000 escapees and a collapsing army at once. 2 weeks later, the trap snapped again. On September 15th, British warships in the East River opened a broadside on the shore at Kip's Bay, and flatboats landed 4,000 troops on Manhattan itself. The Connecticut militia facing them ran without firing. Washington rode into the fleeing mob, by some accounts slashing at officers with his cane, and could not stop a single company. The army escaped up the island to Harlem Heights, where the next day it turned, and for the first time in the campaign, pushed British light infantry backward in an open fight. It was a skirmish, not a victory, but men who had run at Kip's Bay held their ground. The army Glover's oarsman had carried off Long Island was learning how to survive. Then Howe tried the Brooklyn trick a third time. In mid-October, he landed thousands of troops on the mainland shore of Westchester, behind Washington's army, aiming to cut the only road of retreat. The force that met them at Pell's Point on October 18th was about 750 men under a Colonel Howe's officers had never bothered to learn much about. It was John Glover and his fishermen. Glover had no orders and no time to get any. From a hilltop that morning, he counted ships and later admitted what he felt, writing that he would have given 1,000 worlds for an experienced general to tell him what to do. Then he did it himself. He hid his regiments behind the stone walls lining the road inland, one behind another, staggered like the rungs of a ladder. As the British column advanced, the first American line rose from behind its wall, fired volleys at close range, then fell back past the next hidden line, which did the same. Each time the column reorganized and pushed forward, another wall erupted. For a full day, 750 men made 4,000 fight for every field. By nightfall, Glover withdrew in good order, having lost around a dozen killed. The delay at Pell's Point helped buy Washington's army the time it needed to march north out of the closing pocket to White Plains. The fishermen had now saved the army twice. What followed was the worst autumn of the war. Fort Washington fell in November with nearly 3,000 men captured, the largest American surrender of the Revolution. The army retreated across New Jersey, shedding deserters, its enlistments expiring by the thousands at year's end. By December, Washington's effective force had fallen to a few thousand men, camped on the Pennsylvania side of an ice-choked river. And it is here that the Brooklyn escape reveals its true shape. On the night of December 25th, 1776, Washington needed an army moved across dark, dangerous water one more time. The men at the oars of the Durham boats were Glover's Marbleheaders. Through wind, sleet, and floating ice, the fishermen ferried some 2,400 soldiers, horses, and 18 cannon across the Delaware without losing a man. The army marched 9 miles through the storm and took Trenton the next morning, capturing nearly 900 Hessians in about an hour. The victory that revived the Revolution was, at bottom, the Brooklyn evacuation run in reverse, this time toward the enemy. Howe would win more battles and take more cities, and none of it would end the war, because the war could only end when the Continental Army died. Washington seems to have understood exactly what he owed. When the army needed a new brigadier general in 1777, he pushed for Glover, and the fisherman who once doubted he deserved command of a skirmish line finished the war a general. His regiment dissolved at the end of 1776. It had existed for barely 2 years. Count what those 2 years contained. And yet, the story America chose to keep was the painting. Washington standing heroically in a boat on the Delaware. Look at that painting again. Someone is rowing it.
The men bent over the oars, faces down, backs straining, are the closest thing the image has to Marblehead fishermen. We remember the man standing up. The Revolution survived because of the men pulling the oars.